In 1667, a medical act was performed that should have been impossible, at least by the logic of the time. A patient was reportedly near death, and the physicians chose the unthinkable, a direct transfusion of another human's blood. The strange part isn't that the attempt was risky. The strange part is that the case was written down in careful detail, copied into medical discussions, and then almost immediately surrounded by contradictions that the record never resolves. The story begins with a world hungry for miracles. 17th century Europe was riddled with infection, famine, and plague aftershocks. Yet the scientific vocabulary for what actually happens in the body was missing. People could observe symptoms, describe pulse, and connect illness with bad air or contaminated water. But they did not understand circulation in the way we do today. And they certainly had no model for blood compatibility. There were no explanations for why some exchanges might help and others might kill, because no one could explain the invisible factors inside the blood itself. Still, the accounts claim this patient survived long enough for the operation to be discussed as a kind of proof. One physician described the procedure with instruments, a route into the body, and the immediate reaction that followed the infusion. The documentation reads like a report meant to convince other professionals, with language that suggests confidence rather than desperation. And the cracks appear. The paperwork doesn't agree on crucial particulars: which donor was used, the donor's condition, how much blood was transferred, and what the patient's exact clinical state was before the procedure began. Even the timeline shifts, as if different copies remembered different events. There's another problem buried inside the narrative. The official description treats blood as a substance that could be transferred and given, almost like liquid medicine. But if the mechanism is wrong, the outcomes become unpredictable. Without knowledge of blood types, the process shouldn't be a controlled intervention. It would be closer to a gamble with the body's immune response, a concept that didn't exist yet. And yet, the record insists the operation should be interpreted as a meaningful success. What makes this case so unsettling is that the contradiction is not a single typo. Multiple sources repeat the claim that the transfusion occurred, but the details diverge in ways that would matter to anyone repeating the experiment. The pages feel like evidence until you notice how the evidence refuses to lock into one consistent picture. The official record ends here. What happened next was never explained in a way that can be tested. Medical journals and private notes from that era often had a different goal than modern clinical reporting. They were persuasive documents meant to carry authority. That means the contradictions may not be accidental. They could reflect uncertainty at the bedside, changes in the patient's condition that were hard to interpret, or even deliberate smoothing of details to protect reputations. In other words, you don't just have a procedure without a theory. You have a theory trying to survive its own documentation. So when people say the first transfusion, they often want a clean origin story, a straight line from bold innovation to scientific breakthrough. But 1667 gives you something messy, an innovation that tried to outrun missing mechanisms, and a set of records that can't decide what actually happened inside the body. The question isn't whether someone attempted transfusion. The question is why the account reads like it should have failed, and why the failure never appears in the same way twice. And that tension between what was attempted and what could be understood sets the stage for the next phase of transfusion history, where the how becomes the battleground, not just the whether. By the 1860s, medicine had a new kind of hunger, not just to treat disease, but to explain it with something as solid as anatomy. Physicians wanted a mechanism that could be tested, repeated, and defended in print. And then, almost abruptly, the idea of germs stopped sounding like speculation and started sounding like a weapon, one that could win arguments, secure funding, and redefine every hospital practice. But the story of germ theory, at least in its early public life, is not a single victory march. It's a war over evidence, fought with petri dishes, language, and human memory. One researcher describes invisible agents behaving like predictable culprits. Another describes the same phenomena, then insists the conclusion is wrong because the controls were imperfect. Even when experiments are careful, interpretation is where the battlefield opens. Tiny differences in air exposure, sample handling, and the cleanliness of equipment become philosophical differences about what counts as proof. In one widely cited line of work, experiments used meat broth to see whether spontaneous generation was real. The common claim is simple: seal the broth, exclude outside contamination, and the life that shouldn't appear doesn't appear. But critics pointed out something uncomfortable. Broths weren't sterile in every practical sense, and sealed was sometimes a matter of degree. If a method wasn't fully understood, a negative result could be read as success or as coincidence. The dispute wasn't only scientific. It was rhetorical. Papers were written to persuade skeptical readers, and the same data could be framed as decisive or inconclusive depending on what you needed the audience to believe. Then came a more pointed shift: the idea that microorganisms, not bad humors or miasmas, could be traced to specific causes. That shift was revolutionary. It also created incentives. If germs were real, then preventive strategies, disinfection, cleanliness, isolation weren't just moral virtues. They became logical necessities. Yet every push toward certainty sparked counterclaims about overreach. Some argued that even if microbes were present, they might be passengers rather than causes. Others complained that the experiments proved something about contamination, not about disease itself. And the disputes kept multiplying because the evidence didn't sit quietly. It behaved differently across settings. A technique that worked in one laboratory could fail in another, not due to fraud, but due to the difficulty of reproducing invisibility with the tools of the day. Microscopes were improving, stains were evolving, and researchers were learning how to interpret what they were seeing. Germ theory demanded a kind of vision that technology hadn't fully mastered, so disagreement could be blamed on incompetence or used as an accusation of dishonesty. In that climate, even honest uncertainty becomes politically useful. There's another layer that rarely fits neatly into modern textbooks: the way investigators argued about priority. Who saw it first? Who named it best? Who published the cleanest version of the method? That rivalry matters because germ theory wasn't only a scientific claim, it was a rearrangement of authority. The people who controlled the narrative could control what counted as reasonable and what was dismissed as mistaken. So when the record changes tone, when an experiment that once sounded tentative begins to sound absolute, that's not just science maturing. That's evidence being recruited. One account describes controlled observations, then abruptly narrows what it will admit. Another provides striking results, but the method details blur where precision would be most useful. In letters and drafts, you can sometimes see the same researcher catching themselves, tightening language as if they feared future scrutiny. That's the paradox. Germ theory advanced through experiments, but those experiments were also shaped by the need to win. And then the most unsettling part: the official trail does not simply finish. It changes. Certain transitional claims appear, are debated fiercely, and then the documentation thins, missing the kind of clarifications that would settle the argument permanently. The debate moves on, but the unresolved discrepancies remain embedded in the narrative like scars. When the next generation asks what was really suppressed, it often isn't asking whether germs were discovered. It's asking why some early evidence refuses to fully survive contact with later retellings, as though the story was edited not to reveal a secret, but to protect a pathway to belief. And that protection has a cost, because the next piece of the mystery is not just who proved germs, but who benefited from which version of proof. It's easy to picture 1796 as a clean starting line, a discovery, a method, then a worldwide remedy. But the trail of smallpox vaccination doesn't move like that. It moves like something being negotiated in real time, under pressure, with incomplete certainty and with documentation that sometimes behaves as if it has something to hide. We begin with the paradox of confidence. Early reports frame vaccination as promising, cautious, and observational. Then, after controversy flares, the same basic claims start to appear with a kind of absolute tone, as though doubt has been edited out. That shift matters because it doesn't follow the normal rhythm of scientific publishing. Science usually adds nuance as methods improve, not removes it as debates intensify. Take the letters and drafts connected to the first wave of inoculation. In some passages, The writer emphasizes variability, different outcomes, different degrees of protection, uncertain comparisons to variolation. In other passages, often later versions or widely circulated summaries, the language tightens. The account becomes smoother. The uncertainty that once sounded like humility begins to sound like certainty without providing the missing intermediate steps. It's as if the blueprint is being kept off stage while the conclusion is already being marketed. One now consider where the record becomes oddly thin. There are gaps not just in dates, but in the kind of detail that would settle arguments for once and for all: exact timing, the full chain of cases, the measurement criteria that distinguish successful from inconclusive. In places where an investigator would normally spell out confounders, the narrative drifts. The official trail doesn't always contradict the earlier drafts. It simply refuses to carry forward the messy specifics that later readers would need to verify the logic. There's also the matter of documentation that survives unevenly. Some trial notes exist in fragmented form, like pages torn out of a notebook before the ink dried. Other records appear only as summaries, written after the fact, translating messy field observations into cleaner outcomes. Those summaries aren't automatically fraud. History is full of imperfect record-keeping, but the pattern repeats too often. When a controversy looms, the most useful methodological details are the very ones that vanish or mutate. And then there's the timeline itself. The way dates and claims seem to synchronize to make vaccination look inevitable. When you line up correspondence, public statements, and later retrospective accounts, the story occasionally skips over the how. Not the what, not that it worked, but the reasoning bridge between observation and accepted proof. The official record ends here, or at least it changes shape there. What happened next was never explained in the same level of granularity that would satisfy the strictest skeptics. So what is the smallpox paradox really asking? Not whether vaccination emerged. It clearly did. The deeper question is why early uncertainty can be seen in private drafts, while later public narratives read like permission slips already signed. If the science advanced through evidence, why do the evidence trails sometimes look curated less like a laboratory log, more like a story being smoothed for survival? As we move forward from this tension between drafts and records, we'll have to ask a sharper thing. When documentation behaves like it's protecting a pathway to belief, who decided what counted as proof and what did not? And that leads us to a different kind of anomaly, one that isn't about missing facts, but about missing people. The smallpox story is not just a paradox about a method. It's a paradox about permission. The private pages show hesitation, revisions, and the messy work of turning observation into something that institutions can safely repeat. Then, as the narrative moves into public hands, the bridge gets straighter. The how becomes smoother, less negotiable, more ceremonial. When evidence behaves like it's trying to preserve momentum, you start to wonder whether the miracle was only scientific or whether it was also managed. Now look at the other two episodes through the same lens. In hospital wards, the leap to antisepsis didn't arrive as a single bright epiphany. It arrived as a disagreement about what could be measured, what could be trusted, and what could be standardized across bodies and buildings. A technique that depends on invisible contamination always invites arguments. And yet, once authority began to endorse it, the adoption curve reads like a straight line drawn with hindsight. The details that would expose resistance, failed attempts, local refusal. Unclear protocols tend to thin out right when the new doctrine needs the least ambiguity. And then there's the third case, where a treatment becomes revolutionary not just because it works, but because the story of why it works becomes the only story you're allowed to hear. Evidence doesn't merely persuade. It gets promoted into policy, licensing, textbooks, and funding. That process can be rational, even necessary, but can also be selective in ways that feel structural. The question is not whether wrong ideas are corrected. The question is whether correction is allowed to remain honest once the institution has invested its authority. Across these episodes, a pattern emerges. When proof is still contested, documentation looks human, uneven, provisional, full of internal debate. When proof becomes official, the record starts to look cleaner than the process that produced it. Methods that would let outsiders replicate the path often fade, while conclusions gain confident shape. It's as if the historical record is less a window onto discovery and more a gatekeeper for belief. 2. That doesn't mean the scientists or physicians were lying as individuals. It means institutions have incentives, and incentives leave traces. If a new standard can't be explained in a way that survives bureaucracy, it may be postponed, reframed, or quietly edited out of the most shareable accounts. If uncertainty threatens trust, it gets translated into cautionary language still true, but no longer disruptive. The evidence remains, but the story that makes it emotionally and politically safe becomes the dominant artifact. So what counts as revolution? Not just the invention itself, but the moment the invention crosses from experiment to infrastructure. The miracle, in other words, is not only what happened in the laboratory or the ward. It's what happened after, when competing explanations were filtered by editors, administrators, and professional gatekeepers. One timeline becomes official by repeatedly answering a single question. Whose version of the evidence will define the standard for everyone else? The unsolved part, that history forgets. It's that history sometimes remembers in a way that protects a pathway. The public narrative is often coherent because someone, somewhere, chose which uncertainties to keep and which to let dissolve. And once that choice is made, later generations inherit not just a treatment, but an approved interpretation of how proof is supposed to arrive. 2. When the record smooths over the reasoning bridge, you can't tell whether the missing pieces were merely slow or whether they were inconvenient. The 3 episodes converge on the same unsettling possibility. That official truth can be less about absolute accuracy and more about institutional survivability. And if that's the pattern, then every modern claim that feels like an inevitability deserves a second look, not to reject progress, but to ask what evidence was allowed to count and what evidence was quietly left out. Point 1.